Thank you, guys, for coming out. My name's Steve Perallo. I'm the Vice President of the Historical Society here. Real quick story about why we're all here. I was getting my truck fixed at Arc Motors a few months back, and I saw an article in this little magazine that they had in the waiting room. So I like history, obviously, so I started reading it, and come across this article about the Newfield murders. Now, when I moved here 13 years ago, I had heard about the murders way back when, and I knew nothing else. So I saw the article, I read it, I took the magazine home with me, and then I contacted CJ, who wrote the article. I said, hey, come on down and do a presentation over here at the Historical Society. And she said yes. So that's why we're all here. And then I did some more job with some research, finding old stuff online, documents and stuff like that, genealogy.com, familysearch.com, stuff like that. So I'll let the girls have that in a moment here. But just some admin notes. We need to use the bathroom in the back corner over there, so you need to cut through the kitchen, or you can go down through our little secondary room, whatever. There's a couple steps going down, so don't trip and fall. We have snacks in the back, and if you haven't signed in, we have a little guest book up front. Near the main entrance there. If you want to sign in there, let us know that you visited us today. That's it. Thank you very much.
The Goodwin murders. The rest of the story. My name. I'm going to talk about murder today. The cold-blooded murder of 4 people in a farmhouse on June 10th, 1900. Everybody hear me okay?
A little bit louder.
If I can.
Thank you.
George Goodwin was 65, Elsie Owen was 76, Fred Birch was 25, and Scott Goodwin was 17. Evil Comes to Newfield is my story about the brutal murder of George Goodwin, his son, housekeeper, and handyman that shocked the town of West Newfield and the New England area. And that's the story. I first heard about this story many years ago and wrote about it in my column in the Sanford News. It caught my interest because of the gruesomeness of the murders back when life was supposed to be much simpler. This is a sad story of murder and greed and the loss of 4 innocent people well-liked in the community. I wanted to keep the story alive so that the family would be honored and remembered. It's just short of 118 years since they died. We have only a certain amount of space when writing for the newspaper or magazine. When I wrote for the Sanford News, I had as much space as I needed. But with the Waterbury Reporter, I have less space. The stories that I have submitted to the Discover Maine magazine have been about 1,000 words. So I had to choose wisely what I wrote. I wrote just the important facts. I had to leave out the gory stuff, but today I have included it. If nobody has any objection to hearing a little of the gory stuff, we'll get on with the story. Any objection? Okay. The Goodwin family. George William Goodwin was a farmer and lived in a quiet farmhouse with his adopted son, handyman, and housekeeper. He was good at business and had received $2,300 in cash for the sale of a woodlot. Authorities believe that was the motive for the murders. He was a veteran of the Civil War and lived in a house which had belonged to his father and his mother. He also bought the house nearby, which was owned by the Cole family. His wife, Sarah Ann, had died in 1891, and this is a copy of that he was in the Civil War. He was a private in the Company C, 17th Maine Regiment Infantry. You see it? West Newfield was thriving in the early 1900s with several businesses, small stores, and schools. The roads were all dirt, and there were no street lights. Almost everyone used horses and buggies back then, but there were a few of the early cars around. I'm not sure how many there were in Newfield, but probably close to the larger cities, there were many more. And I have the map of West Newfield and Newfield here. And the Goodwin Road is up here and the right-hand side. And that shows there's a little dot where the farmhouse was up there. The murder. George Champion came to Goodwin's house a few days earlier, asking to stay over for a while. Goodwin agreed to it and found some work for him. Champion was familiar with the area, as he had lived in West Newfield before, and he was born in Effingham, New Hampshire. Champion told a lie to cover up what had actually happened, and little did Goodwin know that Champion was actually hiding out because of an incident in Boston. Champion had attacked Harold Poole, a young man from the Salem area, on June 2nd in the Back Bay district of Boston, who ended up in City Hospital in semi-consciousness. Authorities thought that Champion was hiding out in Somersworth in the woods and checked every train going and coming into the Intervale Junction. This is our murderer. Come on, they get in the dark alley. Okay, where am I? On the night of June 10th, Champion found out that the handyman, Fred Birch, would be returning to the farm, and that made him uncomfortable. He didn't want anyone else to know that he was there. He had a reason for his cunning behavior and a dark secret. Champion plotted and waited. It is believed that he first took the lives of Goodwin and the housekeeper, and then waited until the other two returned home. Before he was done, he had killed everyone. Stole Scott's tan shoes, stole Goodwin's money and watches, set fire to the buildings, and killed the animals. Champion sneaks away. Champion left the burning farmhouse and walked the half-mile to the main road, which is Route 110, and then up Route 153 at Woodman's Corner in East Wakefield, New Hampshire. And then he started his long trek to the train station in Union, New Hampshire. It was the middle of the night, and it was dark. He was traveling on dirt roads all the way to the train station, and he was wearing a bloody shirt. He probably didn't want to call attention to himself, so he may not have had a lantern. There were no street lights, but he walked the 19 miles to the train station, which gave him plenty of time to think about what he had done. Was he at all remorseful, or just a monster who took whatever he wanted? He bought a new shirt in Farmington, had some drinks, wrapped up the bloody shirt and left it there, and then continued on his way to Boston. Good so far? Yeah. The first person to notice the fire was Edward Nutter, who was on his way to East Wakefield at 2 a.m. with his brother. He spotted the flames but did not know that anyone was in the buildings. He went to the house of George Chick and woke him up. And Chick said that he would go up in a while, but he went back to sleep. The boys went about their business. They did not think that it was important enough to arouse anyone else in the vicinity or to check it out. At 5 a.m., John Drew, who lived a third of a mile away, came to take care of his cow, which he kept on Goodwin's farm. He found the farm and the outbuildings completely burned, as well as most of the animals. The farm was still burning when he hurried off to a nearby farm to report his discovery. Within 2 hours, there was a large crowd of farmers and the officers. First on the gruesome scene was J.H. Miles of Saco and Fred Spencer Berwick, who had been working on another murder case. Sheriff Usher B. Thompson of Newfield and Coroner Charles M. Moulton went to the scene also. They formed a bucket brigade to extinguish the fire, and then as soon as the ruins had cooled enough, the search for the bodies began. The fire had left little of the bodies, with the exception of the trunks and the heads. Their limbs had been burned. By nightfall, all of the bodies had been identified, but the fire did not destroy the evidence of the crime. And at that time, the officers were told of another man who was there with Goodwin, which Goodwin hired as a handyman, sorry about that. George Champion was that man. According to Dr. Melvin Levitt of Effingham, New Hampshire, George and Scott Goodwin were very badly burned, and it was difficult to determine whether or not they were the victims of violence. Fred Birch was in better condition, but his head had been crushed by an axe or something. His throat had been cut, and a deep slash across his chest had punctured his heart. Mrs. Horn was struck in the head, which crushed it. All the occupants of the house had crushed skulls.
Okay. George Goodwin and Scott slept on the second floor, and the other two slept on the ground floor. George was found in his room, and Scott was found in the hallway to his room. It was believed by Constable S.L. Adams of West Newfield that the murders were a cover-up for the crime scene of robbery. The neighbors got nervous and made sure their doors were locked securely at night. Imaginations ran wild, and everyone was fearful that the ghosts would appear out of nowhere and roam around the area. They slept with a light burning all night and a shotgun loaded. The investigation. The officers chased down other leads, but Champion was their main suspect. A neighborhood friend of Scott Goodwin's, Leon Moore, told the officers that Champion had wanted to lay low at the farm for a while due to some trouble in Boston. Meanwhile, in Boston, while this was happening in Maine, Mrs. Champion had pulled up roots and moved out of their living quarters in the south end of Boston. She packed all her belongings and had a mover pick up the furniture. Then she had her trunk shipped to the new place. When asked where she had gone, nobody really knew. They assumed it was to join her husband, and they also thought that it was because of the Harold Poole's incident. At that time, she had no information that he was in Newfield and about the murder there. The chase and the capture. Inspector McCausland was on the case and working with the local cops in Boston. He wanted to question Champion, and the chase was on. The description of Champion was that he was 40, 5'11" tall, and had one missing finger, dark complected, dark hair, dark eyes, and a mustache. He eventually found out that Champion was in the area. June 12th, Champion arrived in Boston on Tuesday and met his wife Margaret. They went to find a boarding house where they could stay, and the trunk arrived then at the boarding house. Under arrest, on June 13th, the inspector discovered that Mrs. Champion's trunk was sent to a boarding house in Milford. They went there along with a patrolman and a Boston Globe reporter to watch the house and talk with the landlady. She gave them a perfect description of the couple. Then they surrounded the house with other patrol officers and waited until he came out. And when he did, they grabbed him and handcuffed him. He admitted his identity and talked with McCausland. Champion talked with the inspector and lied about what happened in Newfield, saying that he had left at 9 p.m. But they took him into custody and knew that they had their man in just 3 days after the murder. Champion was apprehended. They had questioned everybody and knew from the interviews that he was the man. But all the while, Champion claimed his innocence. His wife went along with him when they took him to jail. McCausland built a case, and then they found the bloody shirt where it had been left. It was found in Effingham, New Hampshire.
Farmington.
Farmington, sorry about that. In a large envelope. 2 officers went to the train station, asked about it, and when they found it, the entire shirt was covered with blood and spatters on the sleeve and the front. It was the most damning evidence of the case. Although Champion had claimed to have a bloody nose, the blood spatters were going up instead of down, as they would have if that was the case. They also found a pocketbook on Champion that belonged to Goodwin. It was what Goodwin had used to carry his cash.
And this is the York County Jail and the courthouse.
And after the extensive interrogation and investigation, he was put under arrest and accused of the murders. Sheriff Thompson and Deputy Sheriff Miles went to Boston by train to assist on Wednesday, June 13th. They had been following the crime. Champion was transferred to Boston and then to Alfred, where he was held without bail until the grand jury met in September. At one point, they thought Champion was breaking down as he had burst into tears, but he regained his composure and seemed to be unruffled.
Okay, so this is the trial at the York County Courthouse. The trial started on October 31st and lasted for just 5 days. There was a huge crowd in front of the courthouse of reporters and spectators who jeered at Champion as he was taken into the courthouse, which was packed inside as well. Harold Poole's father showed up and confronted Champion outside the courthouse and asked him if he knew who he was. Champion said that he was not sure. Poole made an angry remark and authorities took Champion away. Okay, evidence. These are the infamous shoes. Several items were brought in as evidence, including a pocket watch which Champion claimed he had bought from Scott. However, according to a member of the Moores family, Scott had the watch when he was at their home on the 10th, and he didn't leave until well after 9 o'clock. The bloody shirt was brought in as evidence, and a small pocketbook which Goodwin kept his money in. A young woman identified it as the one which she had given him. The most damaging evidence came in with the tan shoes. Mr. Demerit, the store owner, identified them as the same shoes that he had sold Scott Goodwin. Mrs. Champion took the stand and said that her husband was always kind and good to her. She had no reason to think that he was capable of these murders. She was questioned about the shoes, and Mrs. Champion knew that her husband definitely wore black shoes all of the time. It was this testimony that may have helped to convince the jury. She may have known how he dressed and how he was with her, but she did not know the evil man that she married. The three most damaging pieces of evidence were the shoes, his wife's testimony, and the bloody shirt. And here are the faded about the lawyers and the courthouse during the trial. The verdict. Champion was questioned for 3 hours the next day. He learned his fate. In just 5 days, Champion was found guilty of murder in the first degree and sentenced to the Maine State Prison in Thomaston for the rest of his life. In the entire time that he was there, he had only one visitor. A Newfield resident was in Knox County and stopped in to see him. And one of the questions that he wanted to know was about the Moore boy and if he was still alive. If it wasn't for him saying that Champion was at Goodwin's that fateful night, he might have been a free man. While the visitor was there, a guard came down to say that he was denied parole again. At that point, he was an old man, and it did not matter anymore. The first wife. Champion's first wife, Alice Davis Champion, died in a nasty fall down the cellar steps back in 1897 at the age of 29. A neighbor, Jean Corson, was with her and said that Alice tried to talk, but there were other people around, so she couldn't say much. Alice lived for a few days before passing away. It was a suspicious death, but nothing could be proved. Most people in the area thought that it was her husband who had pushed her down the stairs. We tried to find out about the Champions and where they were living at the time, but there was no information. About Champion. He was born on June 20th, 1861 in Effingham, New Hampshire, and died in the Maine State Prison on September 7th, 1946, at the age of 84. He married his second wife in 1900, and she died while he was in prison. He lived in West Newfield from 1889 to 1898, doing odd jobs as a carpenter, a farmhand, and a painter. Champion is buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery. Okay, the cemeteries. George Goodwin and his son Scott are buried in the Springfield Cemetery, and I have some flyers there. Elsie Horn is buried in the Acton Cemetery, and Fred Birch was not found. About the newspapers. Here are all the newspapers that covered the story at the time that it happened. Boston Globe, Boston Herald, all of the big newspapers in that area. And so the facts differ in the different newspaper reports, so information may vary a little. They were quite faded and hard to read at times. So that is the story of the night. That's it. Very good. Thank you, Janet. Thank you, Steve, for your help on this. Sherry and Carol? Thank you all for coming.
You know, you look like that.